Okay, cool. Well, welcome tonight. We are thrilled to have you for our 18th learning hour of the year, which is crazy. But we are focusing a lot tonight on resumes and professional development. Caleb's going to walk us through a few different exercises, and in a few minutes, too, Molly's going to send out a few links. Just a few things to keep in mind. Every year we have environmental design-based scholarships that are available, and Caleb's going to walk us through a little bit more about what that means. But February should always be a month that you are thinking about in terms of scholarships that are available for our students that can be applied to the next reoccurring year for you. We also have scholarships that are available for seniors that are graduating, and I know that Will's been looking at a few of those specifically for graduate school and jobs. So there's a lot of different things, and Molly just posted that link below for you. Additionally, we have other resources for you, like faculty mentorship with your portfolios, where they will actually do one-on-one appointments with you and talk about your different portfolios and give you some different advice. Please keep in mind that this is a totally individualized process. Everyone has a thought or an opinion regarding the process. So be mindful that there should be some creative freedom in this, that you shouldn't ever follow just a standard, but really put your own spin on that. And that's what Caleb's going to talk about with us tonight, is professional branding and kind of what that means to convey your story through your work. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Caleb and we will get this started.
Awesome. Thank you, Dylan. All right. Yeah. So like Dylan said, tonight I'm going to be talking about resumes a little bit, but kind of through the lens of professional branding, and then also kind of just give a little bit more information about environmental design scholarships. But before I get into any of that, once we're done with the presentation, we're going to break out into breakout rooms like we usually do. And there are going to be two different options for you guys. And so I kind of want to get a gauge of what you would prefer to do before we start the presentation, so then Molly in the background can kind of start putting you guys into the breakout rooms that go along with what you would prefer to do. So our first option, group one, is going to kind of do just a personal professional branding workshop, which will be talking through sort of like how you want to be perceived professionally, what sort of things you might want to add to your resume, and just kind of have a discussion-based group. And then the second option is if you already have a resume or an environmental design like scholarship application or any professional document that you're already working on, then you can go into group two and then get kind of more of a one-on-one help with one of our ELP mentors. So if you guys want to think about right now which one you'd prefer to do, and then just put a 1 for group 1 or 2 for group 2 in the chat, that'll help Molly kind of start getting that. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of give a little bit of an environmental design scholarship plug. As Dylan was talking about, this is something that happens every February in environmental design, so something that you'll want to be thinking about every February if that's something you're interested in. So this year there's $40,000+ up for grabs, so a little motivation there for you. And the deadline is February 15th, which is this next Monday. So you have 7 days to get everything in order, which should be plenty of time. The way that you can go about applying is either, first of all, Molly put in a link in the chat that should be able to give you lots of information about how to navigate and get to the scholarship. But if you want, you can also just go to Buff Portal, search for the scholarships tab, and then be able to access it from there. So when you're doing your scholarship application, you'll notice that there's 3 main sections that are required of you. The first being the essay and the application itself. Then you'll have 2 letters of recommendation and then a portfolio. And so all those 3 things come together to then create your full scholarship application. So we're going to kind of talk about some tips regarding each of those 3 things, and then give you guys a chance to ask any questions you have about that process. So a couple main frequently asked questions that we get is, first of all, when to start asking for letters of recommendation. So given that we're about a week out, it would be a good idea to start kind of asking your studio instructors now about getting a letter of recommendation. So if you're interested in applying, that's something that should be on your mind. One thing that's really nice about this application is that even though your deadline is February 15th, that doesn't necessarily mean that your recommender's deadline is February 15th. So it's still totally acceptable for you guys to be asking them now, even with just a week to the deadline, because on that deadline, that's when they're going to get an email asking them to then write that letter of recommendation for you. But it would still be pretty nice of you to just be able to ask that about a week in advance, so it doesn't seem like it's a last-minute thought that you're asking for a letter of recommendation. Another question we often get is who to ask for a letter of recommendation. And it's strongly suggested that you look towards your studio instructors, if at all possible, to give you those letters, because that's typically favored a little bit more in the studio or in the process of reviewing these scholarships. However, if you can't get 2 studio instructors for references, it would be appropriate to get like a professional reference, someone you've worked with before, or anyone else in environmental design. But if at all possible, it's definitely suggested to look towards studio instructors. Another question a lot of people have is about financial need and whether that's a consideration for scholarships. The way this application works is it actually applies you for a whole range of scholarships. So the answer depends based on the scholarship. But because many of them do have a financial need aspect to it, it could be in your best interest to refile your FAFSA. So that's something that you should be considering because they will have access to that when reviewing your application. And then finally, another question that's quite common is kind of people being a little bit worried about the portfolio, especially when they're freshmen because they feel like they don't have as much work. One thing that's really important to know is that there's a whole subset of scholarships put aside for freshmen, which is really nice because that means that you're quote unquote competing against people who have had similar experiences to you. So it's totally appropriate to just put in work from your first 2 studios that you've had from architecture and EPOD. And it's also totally appropriate, in fact, encouraged to put in process work, not just your final images, but kind of allow the people who are reviewing your scholarship to see the way that you design, the way that you're thinking, and kind of how you're using projects to explore what interests you as a designer. So do you guys have any questions about the scholarship aspect of this talk before I move on?
I'm a transfer student, so this is my first semester. So I've only been in my studio class for like a few weeks, and I really don't have a lot of work that I would even be able to use for a portfolio. So does that just kind of mean that I'm stuck till next year?
No, I would say no. I'll let Dylan probably answer this as well, but my first thought on that is that it would be probably like beneficial just to ask other people from like other professionals that you've worked with or other professors and be able to then explain in an essay your situation. And I think people would be understanding of that. But Dylan, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really, really good question, and we get it every year. To Caleb's point, that design iterative process is just as important as the final product. So recognizing even though you just started with us in January, you still have examples of some of the different projects you've done through tech and other things. Even if it's not a final state, it's still an example of the process in which you're working, and you can supplement that with text as well to talk more about who you are as a designer. Also, that's where advisors also become really great letters of recommendation as well, is that we can speak to the ways in which you've transitioned well into the program and other things like that as well. So do not count yourself out by any means. This is eligible to anyone that is currently in our program, whether you're 4 weeks in or 4 years in. There is that same equitable process there. Colleen, like you and I could go through it in an advising appointment if you wanted to go over some examples together too. So, and I offer that to anybody. Fernando or I would be happy to go over that with you individually if you need that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Are you referring to like specific scholarships or like just a general umbrella scholarship application?
So there's like one specific umbrella application that will then make you eligible for any of the environmental design scholarships, and it kind of will match you. Like there's a bunch of questions, and so it'll kind of match you with what you're eligible for. So it's kind of nice. You just have to submit one thing, and then you're applying essentially to multiple scholarships.
And it automatically does that for you, or you have to select and apply?
It'll just automatically apply you for everything that you're eligible for.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Brianna Rose, to your point as well, there are a few scholarships that are creative components, so like photography or research focused. So those will have some supplemental questions to it or will require supplemental documents, but you'll know that going in. And then if there is a direction where you have more creative choice, it will show you every requirement that is designated for those scholarships. So if you find yourself on a page with every scholarship that ENBD has within our school, it will show you like, this is for a first year student that has a GPA above this, or this is just for any design student with photography work within the School of Environmental Design, and the only requirement is receiving a degree from environmental design. So it will be a little bit, you know, if you find yourself being able to select certain things, it should show you every requirement possible. But to Caleb's point, they've made it a lot more fluid where they kind of have an algorithm based on the way that you answer. It directly applies you into that umbrella. And then you'll have a few other options there that you can pre-select into when you get into your classes later on with like research and photography and other things like that.
Okay. I'm looking at like what I'm thinking you're talking about in the Buff portal, and I believe I've applied for the umbrella one, and it says other recommended opportunities after that. So I've completed it probably at that point, and that's an option. Okay.
One other thing to be careful of is when you do apply for the scholarship, there you'll see the general CU scholarship application, and then under that you'll see the environmental designs application. So you'll want to make sure that you're fulfilling the environmental design one if you want to be considered for environmental design scholarships. Yeah. Okay, so second part of this talk, we're going to be kind of talking about the idea of professional branding as it relates to resumes. Since a lot of us already probably have a resume or some experience or understanding of resumes, I thought it would be nice to just kind of think about what a resume is like doing in a bigger picture and other ways to kind of just advance yourself professionally. So starting off kind of with a big picture look at the topic, I think one thing that's really helpful to think about whenever you're submitting any kind of professional document is not necessarily to think about yourself, but think about the employer or the person giving out the scholarship. Realize that it's actually less about you and more about the person who's going to be reading your resume or giving out the scholarship. And you're trying to ask yourself, what do you have to offer to this person? What are they looking for? And those sorts of ways of thinking are a really good way to go about this. It's not necessarily to be manipulative or lie or like try to be like, oh, I want to do what they want me to do, but more so to think about what it is truly that you authentically offer and being sure that you're presenting those aspects of yourself to that person in a way that they'll be receptive to. So this is a quote that I really like from the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It talks about how people who put themselves in the place of other people and understand their minds never need to worry about the future has in store for them. So I think it's really helpful whenever you're writing an essay or a resume or anything to just be kind of thinking not only about yourself and what you're being offered, but what you're offering to someone and what they might be looking for and what it is that you can bring to that. So then the question arises, what does an employer look for, or how do they actually know about you in the first place? So according to Michael Ellsberg, who is the author of this book, usually an employer kind of knows about someone through 4 different main techniques. The first would be if you already have a pre-existing reputation that precedes you in the industry. Another way would be an internet presence, like when someone Googles you, what do they see that pops up? A third way is empirical evidence. So in environmental design, that's sort of like a portfolio or a project that you can show them that shows that you have tangible skills. And then the fourth thing on that list is a resume, which just kind of indicates an overview of your skills, your education, your experience. But the reason that I think this is a really important concept to understand is that all 4 of these things are ways that people can understand who you are professionally or kind of get to read your brand and get to know who you are as a professional. So kind of the idea behind bringing this up is to think about your resume as part of having a professional brand, but also think of other ways that as you go through your professional career that you can kind of get people to start knowing more about you and explaining your professional brand, whether that do be through like an internet presence or being able to provide a really high level portfolio, or as you get further into your career, kind of building a reputation in your industry, networking with the right people, all those sorts of things. So it's good to kind of think of that as a holistic process, that a resume is just a tool and part of that. So like I said, it's kind of helpful to think this in terms of professional brand. I think a lot of the times when people hear the term brand, it's kind of just thrown around, but essentially it's very simply just what people think of when they hear your name, which is something that you want to be thinking about whenever you submit professional documents or are thinking about networking and those sorts of things. So if we break that idea of professional brand down, I think there's really 2 things to be considering. The first is that part of your brand is your story, which might be what you kind of think of as your resume or building a resume, all the things that you've done, your projects, internships, experiences, what your character's like. And the good news is that everyone automatically already has a story based off the things that you're interested in, the things that you've done, and those sorts of things. But the second component that's crucial to having a professional brand is being able to bring some kind of aspect of marketing, making sure that people understand and see and have a way of knowing who you are professionally. When people hear your name, they don't think of anything, then you essentially don't have a brand. So that's why things like a resume or a blog or a web portfolio or networking are all really great ways and crucial components of propelling a professional brand forward. So when you're thinking about having a resume, you gotta start thinking of it more as a tool for being able to kind of market what you're story is, and like all these things that you've done and what you want people to be thinking of you like. And then if we break this kind of analogy down a little bit more, we can look at kind of some tips relating to how you tell this story. So here we have two examples of the same person kind of going about telling a story to someone who's going to give out a scholarship or someone who's going to hire in two different ways. On the left, you have someone who says, I went to CU Boulder, got a 3.6 GPA, and I'm really good at working with people. There's nothing wrong with this kind of story, but as you can kind of see, it's a little bit less descriptive as some other ways of going about it. And typically the employer or the person giving out the scholarship will be like, this person seems pretty good. They got pretty good grades. I wonder what brought them to this scholarship, or why are they interested in this job? They might have more questions, but it's not necessarily like a horrible first impression. But on the right, you can see another way of going about this is talking about your interests. So for example, I was really interested in how I can improve the architecture of public housing. So I did a capstone research project on the issue. I met industry leader X and worked on a project in Denver. You can see how that kind of way of telling a story, like being able to have that story to tell by doing the right things, as well as kind of framing your story in that way, is a really good way to kind of be able to tell your employer or the person giving out the scholarship a lot more about you. From that kind of story, they see that you already have proven interest, that you have good connections, that you're capable of providing high level work because you've already done it. So you can see how important that ability to tell your story becomes in this process. And then if we go to the flip side of that coin, towards some marketing tips, ways of making sure that your story is out there so that people can think of you when they hear your name and think of your story. There's several ways to go about this. Since a lot of us are just starting out in our professions and we don't necessarily have a reputation or like a huge blog about what we're interested in, a lot of us do have to rely on resumes and essays and those sort of things. So the first tip is to make sure that you practice telling your story, apply for lots of opportunities, and always be revisiting your narrative and kind of thinking about what you want people to see from you, and therefore what sort of things that you should be maybe adding to your resume and ways that you can go about explaining yourself in interviews and those sorts of things. So always kind of practicing. But another tip is to kind of get more creative about the ways that you think about marketing yourself and branding your professional story a little bit. Not necessarily always relying on a resume, but maybe looking towards things like having a website, having a social media presence. I heard of a story where someone actually advertised on Facebook, like spent money to have an advertisement saying like, I'm looking for this kind of job, like, can you help me? And she ended up being able to connect to industry leaders that way and kind of just showed that she was a very innovative person. So there's just so many creative ways to kind of go about getting yourself out there and marketing yourself. And then also networking, which is kind of a buzzword, obviously. So I think a couple really good ways to think about networking is to make sure that when you do have an opportunity to meet someone professionally, to be in the mindset of a giver instead of a taker. So how can you help that person? If you can't really offer them anything, just offer like them curiosity and enthusiasm and a good conversation, and do so in a genuine way. There's always some good questions you can ask, like asking about what's interesting in their work or what's difficult in their work. Those are always good go-to things. But again, obviously networking is another good way to kind of get your professional brand out there. All right, and then finally, just to close this all out, I just want to talk quickly about how we can apply this idea of professional branding to something concrete like the ENVD scholarship application. So a couple ideas that I thought of that kind of relate is making sure that when you are applying for this scholarship, that you let your personality shine through in your materials. So don't necessarily always feel like you have to play it safe in every single way. It's okay to kind of talk about how when you were given a project, you sort of changed it a little bit to explore what you were interested in. They love to hear that, like what motivates you as a designer. If you think of a joke and it fits in your essay, that's fine. It's always good to just kind of let that show through. You also might want to think about your overall story when you submit all of your materials together. Are they cohesive? Are they telling what you want people to be thinking of? You might also want to try having consistent physical brand. Like if you're submitting a portfolio, it might be helpful to kind of have consistent text throughout that, consistent colors, all those sorts of things. And then finally, you might want to start thinking about, is there anything you want to add to your portfolio over time to kind of make sure that you're bolstering up this professional narrative that you're working on. All right, so that wraps up my presentation.
Great. I'm just going to emphasize one point that Caleb made that still shook me to my core, that you knew this already about your own experience, Caleb. So this is great, is his example around the language that you all are talking about, like who am I as a designer, what my passions are. The example that he had on the left about I'm a CU student studying environmental design, architecture, and I had a 3.66 GPA versus what you can tell with your story. That is the reason you will get an opportunity to interview somewhere or not. The way in which you stand out on paper is the way in which an employer can read and match your experience. And if I had the only thing I would add to it, and this is not by any means cheating a game, is understanding what does that firm stand for and what verbiage can you tie to the language that you use for yourself. So when you see someone that is focused on affordable housing and areas of reinvesting in areas that have been gentrified, if you are passionate about those areas and you have work that examples those areas, enfold those key variables into the way in which you're talking about your pieces. It is okay to adapt your language to reflect the narrative of the firm that's already standing and it has identified that for themselves. It is not like, oh, I'm compromising my narrative because of the words they're using. It's actually flipping it to say, we align and I want to talk more. And so that is absolutely huge. Way to go on that example tonight, Caleb, because I really am emphasizing that to every group, that people who get jobs and get internships earlier are those that can speak to the narrative of the firm. And that is just one of the, doesn't matter the level of work you've been able to have examples of at that point. They want to teach you, they want to mold you, they want to grow you, but you have to be able to speak the same language that they do. And so having some of those same examples is super important, while also keeping it your own. You don't want to like literally copy their mission, because then that becomes a whole different issue. But really speaking to that is so important. So well done, Caleb. If that is one thing you guys can take away tonight, it would be that particular piece from my end in the years that I've been working with EMBDs. So very, very cool. So awesome. Well, I will let you keep doing your great process here. I won't intrude any further, but great examples, and these passion points are going to be really important to the way that you convey your message. So cool.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Caleb.
Dylan.
Yeah.
There's also a photography scholarship that very few people enter, and it's just a photograph. So if you've taken a photograph, I would submit for that one.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. I gotta go though.
Sure.
Thank you. Bye.
And then Dylan, we had a question about being able to edit after you submit your scholar. Can they re-edit, or can they edit it after they've submitted?
Really good question. I don't know that you can. I think it is one submission and then you're done. You can try resubmitting afterwards, but otherwise what I would do is, if it's before the deadline, I would contact the financial aid office and see if they can reopen and delete your submission so you can resubmit. So given since it is through a third-party office, it's not internal to EMBD that we submit.
I just looked like on the application again, and I had already submitted, and there was like a button that said update application, so maybe that works for
they had talked about launching that this year. We just didn't get confirmation if they did it. So if you can see that, I wasn't going to give you false hope with that update button. So if you can see that, Lakin, great, run with that, update it, and then yep, essentially you have up until the 15th then to make any changes to the materials that you're submitting.
Okay, and then also when I was looking at the application, I didn't see like a place to submit a resume. I just saw the place to submit the portfolio. So are you just expected to submit one too?
Have their resume in a consolidated form within the portfolio, typically like page 2 or 3 before you get into your work. Or at the end, just depends stylistically on what you are conveying as your story. So you would only need to do one upload, and typically you will condense to the very high level points of your resume into your portfolio itself.
Okay.
Use one page for it. Don't go any further than that.
And then with that, for recommendations, how long do professors have? Is it the 15th or do they have longer to submit?
Longer. Typically the scholarship committee, which is faculty and staff and administration, we all convene to review every submission, as you know, if that's the committee that we serve on. And so with that, we, I think, have like a week or two after the deadline from the students to actually submit our internal work, which is the letters and the points. So I wouldn't be fearful if you haven't asked anybody, and you know, given that the deadline is Monday. We all know and we all work with the people that are reviewing. So we have a pretty like mutual discussion point of like, okay, great. You know, I have students that will email me on the 15th, and I typically have a cutoff of 5 scholarships because they do take time. So that's really where you're being more mindful, is a lot of us do have a cap of the amount of people we can talk and speak of, because, you know, we give quite a bit of time to each individual. So that's part of the process there, is just being more mindful of we can't do 25 letters, you know, type of thing in that process. So it's more just being mindful of that for the person that's reviewing. But it's also, as a first year student, we recognize that you've not gone through this process yet. So a lot of us that are dedicated to first and second year, we recognize that, you know, as long as you meet that deadline and you inquire in a very professional manner, there will be some consideration offered there, and we'll do what we can to promote that to the best of our ability for you in the ways and impact that you've had. So
I guess if we're like reaching out to someone, I'm sending an email tonight probably. Like should we say should we set like a date? Like is that like it's not February 15th, or should we just like, should I give them a time frame or just ask? Like
in someone internal to EMBD, Annie?
Yeah, it's like my studio instructors.
Yeah, you don't need to set a date for us, because what happens is when you put us down as your recommender, we actually get a third-party email that says, you know, Annie has submitted you as a letter of recommend, you know, as someone to recommend. The best way to do that, though, is to send the email, get the confirmation, and then put their name forward. It's always a little more challenging when we get the email. It says, Annie has made you a recommender, and it's like, I didn't talk to Annie. What does Annie want me to recommend her for? Like, is this for a job? Is this for a scholarship? Like, we don't always have that full context. So even if it's just a quick like email component there, and yeah, whenever you send it is absolutely fine. Just, you know, acknowledging the fact that you're applying for some internal scholarships and things like that is the most appropriate part of it. So as long as you have that, then you at least have a few days to work with before you need to submit anything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to say it's the worst thing in the world if you send if you put us down before you email us, but please email us to tell us why you've chosen us, and things like that is so important. So if you have already submitted people's names, then feel free to just send them a follow-up email now, and just know in the future, it's always preferred that way. But again, you haven't gone through this process yet, so it's absolutely okay if you went the other way around. It's not like we're not going to submit something strong on your behalf because you chose to send in that form first. So
it doesn't submit it if you haven't submitted your application, right? Or
if you submit them with their email and you save it and you move on, there is a chance we will already get a notification point there. So be mindful that sometimes they do trigger that, depending on if it's a CU level scholarship or an EMBD one. But typically when you submit everything, then we get a submission. But like Will, for example, and Molly both did grad school this year as applications, and I wrote a letter for each of them. So once they said Dylan is a recommender and saved that, I got an email before they had even submitted all of their documents. So it is best to confirm with them before you put their name in, because you don't always know what the process is. So I just give that as a different example, that when they were looking at their graduate programs, I know that they hadn't submitted things yet because we were looking at stuff together or talking things out, but once I had confirmed, they put my name in and I got that email. So always rule on the side that by putting their name in, they're going to get a targeted email because of it. I would use that as a rule of thumb.